We will now discuss some basic plant biology. We won't actually say much about green algae. However, we do think that land plants evolved from green algae. But we will instead focus on the life cycle of some land plants, specifically mosses, ferns, as well as flowering plants. So let's begin with a discussion of the fundamental life cycle common to all plants. Just for some perspective, if you think about human beings, we pretty much exist entirely as diploid organisms. The only haploid stage of our life cycle essentially are our gametes, namely sperm and eggs. Plants, however, are a little bit different. Again, it doesn't matter which plant you're talking about. All plants follow the same fundamental life cycle. We refer to this as an alternation of generations, referring to this basic idea that plants alternate between diploid sporophytes, or spore-producing plants, and haploid gametophytes, or haploid gamete-bearing plants. So again, all plants follow this fundamental life cycle. So let's explore a bit about this alternation of generations. Sporophytes are diploid. This portion of the life cycle contains cells that are specialized to undergo meiosis, hence the arrow with a hash mark, undergo meiosis to produce spores. Spores are always haploid and, of course, are produced as a result of meiosis. It doesn't matter which plant you're talking about, spores always grow into gametophytes. Gametophytes, again, these are haploid structures. They're multicellular, and these are the structures that ultimately produce gametes, namely sperm and eggs. So gametes are produced. Notice that the gametophyte cells are haploid. The gametes themselves are haploid, so there's been no change in the number of chromosomes here. So in plants, this is counterintuitive, but in plants, gametes, right, sperm and eggs, these are produced by mitosis and not meiosis. Gametes then undergo fertilization. So sperm fertilizes an egg cell. That gives us a diploid embryo. That diploid embryo then grows into a new diploid sporophyte, thus completing the entire life cycle. So again, just a few things to keep in mind. As we already mentioned, in plants, gametes are produced by mitosis, not meiosis. And also, don't confuse spores with sperm. So spores and sperm, two totally different stages within the reproductive cycle of plants. So again, even if you don't remember the details of moss life cycles or fern life cycles or flowering plant life cycles, as we'll explore in just a few minutes, if you just keep this fundamental life cycle in mind, you have a good understanding of the basic components of plant life cycles. So let's now explore just a few groups of land plants, beginning with some of the earliest plants that are still around today, exemplified by this group we call bryophytes. Bryophytes includes a few that many people aren't quite so familiar with, namely liverworts and hornworts, but the bryophytes also includes mosses. Many people are fairly familiar with mosses. These are plants that tend to grow fairly small. One of the characteristics of bryophytes, including mosses, is they don't produce vascular tissue, so they don't produce xylem nor phloem. As a result, they simply can't grow very large. They also produce motile sperm that literally have to gel and have to swim in order to fertilize an egg. This is sort of a throwback to the green algal ancestors of all land plants. So mosses, they rely on an external source of water, namely rain or dew, in order for fertilization to actually take place. So let's just take a brief look at the basic life cycle of mosses. Again, like all plants, mosses alternate between haploid gametophytes, shown on the left here, and diploid sporophytes, these brown structures growing on the top of the gametophytes. So let's just see how the sporophytes and gametophytes are related throughout the life cycle. So beginning on the far left, we have the green leafy portion of mosses. Those are the haploid gametophytes. Again, gametophytes always produce gametes. So at the very tips of these gametophytes, we have sperm being produced, and again, they are motile, as well as eggs being produced. So what happens is when sperm are released, they literally swim to an egg located at the top of another gametophyte. When an egg is fertilized, we have a zygote produced. That zygote, which of course is diploid, that zygote then develops into a mature sporophyte. This diploid brown structure we see growing on the top of these female gametophytes that were previously fertilized. So the sporophytes, again, they produce spores. So at the top of the sporophytes are these spore capsules, which contains cells that are specialized to undergo meiosis. And again, meiosis produces spores, which are haploid. In mosses, the spores may blow around for a while, but eventually they land somewhere. When conditions are right, when there's moisture available, the spores will grow into gametophytes, as spores always do, thus completing the moss life cycle. Notice in mosses that it's the gametophyte that tends to be the dominant stage of the life cycle. So the gametophytes, they're green and photosynthetic. They can live just fine on their own. The sporophyte, however, relies on the gametophytes for their existence because the sporophytes actually absorb their nutrients from the gametophytes. So again, in mosses, we have the gametophyte as the dominant stage of the life cycle. But notice mosses don't grow very tall, again, because they don't produce vascular tissue. So let's look at a few other plants that indeed produce true vascular tissue. So vascular plants, these are plants that produce xylem and phloem, and these are, of course, are cells specialized for transporting water and nutrients throughout the plant body. Let's take a look at another major group of plants exemplified by ferns. So ferns, we're talking about vascular plants. And so these can obviously grow a lot larger than can mosses. So a brief look at the fern life cycle. Again, ferns, like all other plants, alternate between sporophytes, illustrated here on the left, as well as gametophytes, illustrated over here toward the right, this little heart-shaped structure. So during the fern life cycle, let's begin with a mature diploid sporophyte. When ferns become mature, often you'll see these yellow structures located on the underside of their leaves. These are actually thousands and thousands of sporangia. So the sporophyte, what we typically think of as a fern plant, these are the spore-producing portions of life cycle. So spores, again, are produced by meiosis. Spores are haploid, single-celled structures. They're released, blown around in the wind for a while. Eventually, they fall to the ground somewhere. And again, if conditions are conducive, they will germinate and grow into gametophytes, as spores always do. Notice in ferns that the gametophytes are bisexual. So here we have a single green leafy gametophyte. I should point out that the gametophytes are fairly small in ferns. They're only maybe a quarter of an inch or so in diameter. But again, they're bisexual, producing both sperm and eggs. The sperm of ferns, just like in mosses, they are motile. So they literally have to swim through water in order to fertilize an egg. So when an egg located on a gametophyte is fertilized, it develops into an embryo. That embryo then develops into a new sporophyte, thus completing the life cycle. I should point out that in ferns, initially the sporophytes are dependent on the gametophytes for their existence. However, it doesn't take long, and these gametophytes will wither away and they'll die. And of course, the sporophytes, being green and photosynthetic, can live entirely on their own at that point. Notice how now we have a shift. Whereas in mosses, the gametophytes were the dominant stage, now in ferns and essentially in all other vascular plants, it's the sporophytes that are dominant. So the sporophytes are the larger of the two phases, and of course they can live pretty much entirely on their own, except when they're first starting out and they initially absorb nutrients from the gametophytes. We should also point out that if you think about the life cycle of ferns and also of mosses previously, we never mentioned anything about seeds. Neither mosses nor ferns produce seeds. They pretty much rely on spores that are released for their dispersal. So spores are, they're okay for dispersal. Spores can actually be dispersed long distances, but is there anything better? Well, it turns out that seeds are another major innovation in the evolutionary history of land plants. So let's just talk briefly about seed plants. And seeds, of course, essentially are these structures that can be dispersed by animals and wind and so forth. These are structures that contain an embryo. So, of course, when a seed is planted, the embryo starts to grow and it grows into a new plant. So seed plants, of course, are a pretty major group of land plants. There are two large groups of seed plants. We won't say much about the gymnosperms at this point. Gymnosperms, this includes things like pine trees and spruce trees. So these are trees, or I should say plants, produce seeds, but they don't produce flowers. The other major group of seed plants are the angiosperms, or flowering plants. So flowering plants, of course, a profoundly important group of plants for many different reasons. Flowers come in a wide variety of shapes and structures and so forth. And of course, they're able to produce lots of different types of fruits and seeds that can be dispersed in many different ways. But for now, let's just focus a few comments on the basic life cycle of flowering plants. So again, like all other plants, flowering plants alternate between diploid sporophytes and haploid gametophytes. When you think of the entire plant itself, that's essentially all part of the sporophyte phase of the life cycle. So the cells of sporophytes, they're all diploid, and these are the parts of the plant that produce spores. So in flowering plants, it turns out that the production of spores takes place within flowers. Spores always, again, doesn't matter which plant you're talking about, spores always grow into gametophytes. So in flowering plants, what exactly do the gametophytes look like, and essentially what are they? Well, in flowering plants, the gametophytes are represented by the pollen grains. The pollen is actually a male gametophyte because they produce sperm, and also embryo sacs, or the female gametophytes, because they produce eggs. So just a few more comments about pollen and embryo sacs, or male and female gametophytes in flowering plants. So here we're looking at a schematic of a flower. A flower has these structures called anthers, which contain specialized cells that can undergo meiosis to produce spores. You typically think, if you think back to mosses and ferns, spores are released in that form, but in flowering plant, these spores grow directly into pollen grains or male gametophytes before they're actually released from the flower. So on the far right, we see a schematic of a young pollen grain. Again, commonly another name for just a male gametophyte, because you notice this generative cell right here. This is a cell that will eventually divide and produce two sperm cells within each pollen grain. So again, pollen grains simply represent the male gametophytes. On the other hand, if we take a look at the female gametophytes, we have to focus on the ovary. This is the part of the flower that eventually will develop into a fruit if the flower is pollinated. Inside the ovary, we might have one to many ovules, illustrated by this pink structure here. Within the ovules, again, there are cells that can undergo meiosis to produce spores, and one of these spores will then develop into the functional female gametophyte, or commonly referred to as an embryo sac. But notice this cell right here, that's an egg cell. So again, this whole structure is a female gametophyte producing an egg cell, and this structure here is sitting there just waiting to be fertilized if indeed this flower is ever pollinated. So I just want to point out that if you think about the gametophytes in flowering plants, these are highly reduced structures, very, very, very small, compared to the gametophytes in, let's say, mosses, which are these relatively large, green leafy, dominant stages of the life cycle of those more primitive types of land plants. So that was very brief, but that gives you a general overview of some of the characteristics of the life cycles of land plants.